This video is sponsored by BetterHelp. In recent years, rail enthusiasts have been publishing their accounts of what appear to be massive freight train shipments containing hundreds of military tanks. And here's the thing that surprises most people. These shipments appear to be operated by commercial rail companies, blending into ordinary freight traffic on civilian tracks. And although it may seem unusual, these accounts actually tie back to the age-old marriage of the military and commercial railways, a phenomenon that has existed basically since the dawn of the steam engine. Though this trend begs a question: why are modern armies still relying on commercial trains to move their most powerful weapons? Stay tuned to find out as we uncover the history of military trains and why thousands of tanks are moved by rail. I'm your host Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. This story really begins in Europe, when 19th century powers were redesigning conflict as a declaration of speed. Across the world, the slow pace of animal transport had begun to feel outdated. And in 1829, when Stephenson's rocket proved that steam engines were reliable and fast enough for practical use, the military took note. Though the pivotal moment came in the summer of 1830, when the Liverpool and Manchester Railway saw one of the world's first regiment departures by train. The engine pulled the men 34 miles in just 2 hours, when historically, that same distance would have taken up to 2 days under optimal circumstances. Remember, when soldiers move, they also need to take all manner of cargo along with them. So the steam train changed everything. This single troop movement sent shockwaves through the continent, as by 1845, Germany's high command had carved nearly 3,300 miles of track, with explicit military use in mind. And it was a general trend. The military world was reorganizing itself around dedicated rail construction. Another symbolic moment came in 1846, when the Kingdom of Prussia funneled 12,000 men, horses, and artillery towards the city of Krakow as a demonstration of their might. And it was effective. The display communicated to everyone that the distance between the enemy and the point of attack had basically vanished. By 1849, the Russians followed suit, dispatching up to 30,000 men towards Austrian lines in a similar flex. And just a year later, the evolution culminated as 75,000 Austrian troops, 8,000 horses, and 1,000 carriages surged towards the Silesian frontier by rail. So that's all to say that in more or less just 20 years, the locomotive had become the cornerstone of any modern military army. In the meantime, the United States was taking notes, and it wouldn't be long before they too would use this new technology for bloodshed. The Civil War was one of the first major American conflicts in which the railroad was both a major tool and a primary target of military action, although the North had the advantage here. You see, at the outset, the Union held over 21,000 miles of track, compared to the Confederacy's 9,000, meaning the Union controlled 70% of the tracks and a staggering amount of the equipment that went on them. This dynamic ensured that they could recover from damage with a speed that the South could never match on horseback. Knowing this, in the early days of 1862, Congress authorized President Lincoln to take possession of the nation's telegraph lines and railroads. This birthed the United States Military Railroad, or USMRR, a move that would eventually manage thousands of miles of track across the theater of operation. Although commercial companies were still allowed to use their assets, the U.S. had priority rights, meaning centralized control shaped what became the Union's dominant force, the military railway. In contrast, the South fought for the right of states to determine their own destiny, meaning there wasn't a centralized force to impose that same level of organization, which would turn out to be a trade-off they'd pay dearly for. For example, during the fights around Chattanooga in 1863, General Hooker moved his staff over 1,000 miles in only 7 days by rail. Later that year, Lincoln ordered 25,000 troops and 10 cannon batteries to move 600 miles in just 11 days. And sources note how, inside the conflict, the machines themselves were changing. For example, during the siege of Petersburg, Union forces deployed a massive rail-mounted mortar known as the Dictator. Weighing over 17,000 pounds, mounted on a reinforced flat car, this represented one of the earliest attempts to turn railroads into mobile artillery platforms. And for better or worse, this idea would only grow more lethal in the decades to come. The hub of this railroad motion was Alexandria Station, a major complex and target of sabotage. It was filled with roundhouses and machine shops, all of which expanded throughout the war. So that's all to say that by the conclusion of this conflict, the inventory had grown to 419 locomotives and 6,330 rail cars. The Civil War had set many standards for military rail, but one that followed forward, in particular, was the hospital train. The very first incarnations of a hospital train were crude, just a series of boxcars and passenger coaches with minimal modifications to accommodate the injured soldiers of the 19th century. However, as time passed, the US military decided to address issues like the unforgiving jolts of the track. Engineers devised a clever solution in which rubber slings that supported stretchers could reduce constant bumping. From there, they stylized the trains with red flags and locomotives with smokestacks painted red to signal their priority status, whereas inside the wagons, surgeons and specialized equipment were on board to increase the wounded's chance of survival. By the time of the Mexican expedition of 1916, hospital trains featured wooden parlor cars, dedicated loading doors, and more advanced solutions for urgent care. And by the time of the Great War, entire custom-built unit trains converted from Pullman cars were carrying the wounded in unprecedented numbers, and not only by Americans. In 1916, for instance, the French utilized ambulance trains to evacuate up to 800 wounded men at a time, providing a mobile lifeline when the heavy grim of combat choked the road networks. By 1917, the US Army also began operating custom-built trains in Europe to care for the fallen soldiers. But the most significant work of these trains actually began when the troops got home. After the war ended, the East Coast saw a flood of sick and wounded soldiers returning. These numbers were so overwhelming that at the port of Hoboken, the Army utilized 3 trains to meet the rising tide of casualties. Over the grueling 15-month period, the crews transported a total of 55,200 casualties to their final destination. By 1920, the mission was complete, and the specific trains used for this service were retired from the reserve. But they would return in a far more sophisticated form upon the outbreak of World War II. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, American railroads were hauling nearly 2 million troops every single month. This logistical beast eventually came to carry the vast majority of all military personnel, not to mention much of the military freight within the United States. While the press liked to focus on truck convoys like the Red Ball Express, the reality was that in many cases, a singular boxcar could carry as much freight as 10 truckloads combined, and with less fuel. But railroad logistics require people. So behind the scenes, the system was kept alive by expanding the workforce to include women, recalled retirees, and draft-deferred railroad workers, many of whom worked exhausting shifts deemed necessary for victory. And it's worth taking a moment to describe the troop trains, though it wasn't romantic, as these troop trains could carry as many as 1,000 men packed into just 21 cars on their way to battle. In some cases, soldiers were said to have slept up to 3 a bunk in their rolling barracks. So how was this all organized? Well, to support operations at home and overseas, the US Army deployed entire railway operating and repair units. The units handled a vast array of things, from restoring destroyed lines to running the timetable. Formally, the US Army's transportation network established a high-priority rail service nicknamed Toot Sweet Express. This expedited service ran between vital European logistics hubs, carrying urgently needed supplies and mail on a tight schedule and in support of the advancing Allied forces. And this task was next to impossible, as the resource strain was so severe that during the winter of 1944 into 45, coal shortages pushed the system to the brink, forcing emergency coordination to keep supplies moving at all. Though there were other dangers, as the railroad wasn't just for transport, it became a weapon. Soviets led the world in weaponizing the tracks, viewing armored trains as an indispensable system for attacking junctions and supporting infantry. Their most successful design, the BP-43, was a rolling fortress equipped with anti-aircraft guns and the turrets of the T-34 tanks. Some Soviet trains even incorporated a terrifying rocket system directly onto the armored wagons. But it doesn't end there. The Germans were also developing some very outrageous technology. They had an entire fleet of armored trains, using G-10 locomotives to protect vital supplies from partisan attacks in congested territories. At the same time, the dictators themselves often lived and commanded from the rails. Adolf Hitler traveled in a massive mobile headquarters named America, while his wingman operated from a similar train. And as evil as they were, I have to admit that America was rather interesting. And I should clarify that it was named America as an ode to reach rather than respect, and it would ultimately be renamed Brandenburg once the United States entered the war. Anyhow, for much of the conflict, it was Hitler's preferred command platform. Although this was a fierce military machine protected by dedicated flank wagons and equipped with anti-aircraft guns, it also featured many of the comforts of home. And its comforts would evolve as Germany began producing a new generation of armored and command trains in 1939. The interiors of America were outfitted with high-quality furnishings, including fittings from the best European factories. That said, to avoid detection and bombardment, these trains were often hidden in pre-built train bunkers, which were massive tunnels and deep cuts that offered essential concealments. Other sources suggest that at times they were also concealed in less obvious areas, such as repurposed mine tunnels. Which brings us to one of the most famous legends of World War II, that Nazi gold train. The theory, or according to academics, myth goes, as Germany collapsed, trains carrying looted gold and artwork were diverted into underground tunnels in an area called Lower Silesia. And once on location, the tunnels were sealed and hidden, meaning the treasure on board was forever lost. While no such train has ever been conclusively discovered, the existence of vast, real unfinished tunnel systems do exist. Add that to the very real disappearance of huge quantities of looted valuables, and the story starts to sound intriguing. And it needs to be emphasized that despite repeated investigations and searches well into our modern time, no definitive proof of such treasure trains has ever been produced, leaving the line between documented wartime concealment and post-war legend blurred at best. With that in mind, the end of the war brought so much destruction that some of the infrastructure was effectively taken off the map. You see, during their retreat, the German army used a device called the track wolf, which was basically a giant steel hook that ripped up wooden rail ties as the train moved, rendering the line behind the train useless to the Allies. Though it was all for nothing, as the Allies repaired key sections at an astonishing pace. We all know how it turned out. By the end of the war, the US had carried roughly 44 million troop movements, operating thousands of troop trains each month. And arguably, the most secretive shipments moved by rail were the classified materials tied to the Manhattan Project, which were transported under strict security and secrecy. But the victory, as great as it was, came at a cost. Years of overuse had worn down the railroads at home, forcing a major post-war overhaul to the entire transportation system. And it wasn't only the railways that needed a new start. Remember, behind every movement, there were people who carried what they saw with them long after the train stopped running. So as the tracks were repaired little by little, many veterans tried to go it alone, searching for a sudden way to heal, if not reinvent themselves. Though, in the end, most resolutions faded as quickly as they were made, not realizing that lasting change rarely comes from abrupt transformation. This part of the video is sponsored by BetterHelp. This topic feels pretty close to home for me. All of my grandfathers fought in World War II, and none of them came home with a healthy mind. I'm sure that most of you watching this have a very similar story. So, as history indeed repeats itself, I got to thinking about all the veterans out there today who are probably going through a hard time and could use a little support. If that sounds like you or someone you love, I'd recommend reaching out to BetterHelp. You simply fill out a questionnaire and get matched with a therapist in just a couple of days. And don't worry, if it's not the right fit, you can easily switch therapist at any time at no extra cost. So if that sounds helpful to you, you can click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/itshistory to get 10% off your first month of therapy. Thanks again, BetterHelp, for supporting the channel. But now, back to our story. The next time the US seriously tested military rail logistics would be in Southeast Asia. As the Vietnam War expanded in the mid-1960s, planners once again asked whether railroads could effectively move heavy supplies. On paper, South Vietnam's coastal rail looked pretty promising. But in reality, years of sabotage had turned it into a liability. Even so, American rail units initially tried to revive the system before ultimately concluding that in a guerrilla war, rail lines were simply too exposed. And with that, in 1972, the last U.S. railroad unit in Vietnam stood down, ending America's final attempt to run combat rail operations with its own forces. But still, military rail use continued to evolve. During the Cold War, it remained central to NATO planning in Europe. Entire armored divisions were meant to move by train in the event of a Warsaw Pact invasion. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union doubled down. For the US, however, the future was elsewhere. It was in partnerships with the military and commercial railroads, a change made unmistakably clear during the Gulf War. In 1990, the US mobilized forces on a scale not seen since World War II. Tanks, vehicles, and ammunition flowed from bases to ports. At this time, many of the shipments were operated by contracted civilian crews. The solution worked beautifully, meaning modern military rail logistics no longer depended on controlling the rails themselves as they did in the past. The new system was far more pragmatic, which brings us back to where we started. Tanks moving by train is nothing new, and as it turns out, it isn't much of a secret. Those freight trains we saw at the top of the video are simply the continuation of what has always been, the logistical backbone of warfare. We'll leave it there for today, but I thank you all for watching, and until next time, I'm Ryan Socash, signing off.